I think I speak for most horror fans out there when I say that no matter how many of these things we watch, there's always going to be a film or two that float to the surface of our mind when we are asked, what's the scariest movie you've ever seen? Now there's a lot of movies out there that often get brought up in this sort of conversation. Titles like The Blair Witch Project or The Exorcist might come up in the discussion, and while I can definitely see the reasons they'd be valid inclusions, they are films that I personally missed the boat on or I watched too late. The Exorcist, for example, doesn't hit nearly as hard for me as it would for someone who hadn't been exposed to some of the modern horror that I have, and I feel that the same can be said for The Blair Witch Project to some degree. Instead, today I'd like to talk about a film that feels very similar in its execution to something like Lake Mungo, which I covered last year. A film which, until this year, I had no idea even existed, but now after watching it, I don't think it's going to be something that I ever forget anytime soon. In fact, I told myself I'd only ever revisit this movie if I was making a video on it, and given that the theme for this month's video was the movies that actually scared me, I think this is a perfect opportunity to talk to you about the Poughkeepsie Tapes. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is a 2007 American pseudo-documentary horror film that feels as though it was a spiritual predecessor to a film like Lake Mungo, purely for the way it orchestrates and structures itself, choosing to root its premise in horror in a world not too dissimilar to our own, and this is one of many things that contributes to this being a rare example of a horror movie that actually scared me. To summarise it in the briefest way possible, this movie is a false documentary posing itself as a real documentation of events, which contributed to many urban legends over the real element of this movie, leading to speculation that this was a genuine snuff film that had been put into circulation. There are other factors that led into why this happened, but we're going to discuss those a little later. It follows the murders of a serial killer in Poughkeepsie, New York, and accomplishes its storytelling through an array of interviews as well as a recently discovered collection of the killer's sick, twisted evidence in a form of tapes. Before we go any further, I'd just like to give a reminder to please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you enjoy. It does genuinely go a massive way in helping the channel's growth. I would like to say right here that this is also a film that thrives on going into it dark. You should not go into this having seen anything about the plot. If possible, try and avoid it. I think it's through doing this that the horror of this film is captured and maintained so well. However, at the same time I want to say that I don't think this movie is going to be an easy watch for most people. While horror is a genre that I believe is built on pushing the boundaries of what we're comfortable with, I would say that if any of the topics on screen right now are something you feel uncomfortable with, I would recommend maybe just staying with me to talk about the film here, because watching this yourself is going to be a really unpleasant viewing experience and it might not be something that you enjoy. One last note before you get into things, please feel free to get down in the comments below after this video and leave me your thoughts on the Poughkeepsie Tapes if you've seen it, and with that out of the way, let's get into things. The film opens with us finding out that a raid was recently carried out in a house in Poughkeepsie. Discovered at the scene is the documentation of a truly disturbed man's sadistic crimes. The source in which this is found is through over 800 videotapes, these being shot by the killer in a horrific visual record of his brutality. To my knowledge, we're not shown every single murder that's on these tapes, which, trust me, I am relieved about, purely because from the ones that I've seen, I really wasn't comfortable watching them at times. I'm really not sure I could stomach any more of these things if they were executed even half as brutally as the ones that were shown. Both state and federal law members are tasked with sifting through the gruesome images with the intention of finding any trace of the killer's identity, his victims' identities, and where he could have disappeared to. Repeated viewings of the materials ultimately led to no major revelations beside the haunting facts of the crimes he committed. As the tapes are studied and observed, it's found that they tend to cause a prolonged feeling of both unease and anxiety, which is something that, as we progress through the story, you'll come to understand completely. As it turns out, the killer doesn't only record footage of the murders themselves. Alongside this, he documents everything from the abductions, the tortures, and even the post-mortem mutilations of his victims, along with some bizarre balloon fetish content, which is something else entirely, all while never allowing his face to be shown on camera. Now, he does appear in several tapes that were shown, but this doesn't lead to anything given that he is always fully disguised, keeping his identity well hidden. From these facts alone, we can gather that the person we're dealing with is an incredibly deranged individual, one that is clearly capable of monstrous things, and that is something that's only going to be further highlighted the more we progress through this. Something that we do learn is that the tapes are numbered in chronological order, something the killer did clearly to document this as more of a timeline than a simple keepsake. This ultimately shows the unfortunate fact that his first victim was an 8-year-old girl.
Driving some days. Could I get a lift into the next town?
Yeah, no problem. Hop in.
Jennifer Gorman was playing in her front garden when the killer stopped his car in front of her. This is a scene that we see play out in a limited capacity. We see the killer documenting his meeting, we hear the impact as he attacks her, and we see the implication that she has been abducted. There is an uncanny realism to the horror found in this film, and this is one of the places that highlights this. This isn't found footage in the sense that the camera is perfectly poised for a precise scare. It doesn't value cinematography, it values the authenticity behind the movement. It would have been incredibly easy and cheap for this attack to be fully shown on screen. It would have made for an uncomfortable viewing, and it also would have added to the horror of the situation. However, despite doing the opposite and obscuring much if not all of the attack itself, it maintains that same visceral reaction because our senses as an audience are limited in this moment. This event is then followed by a progression of the killer's desire for blood as his attacks become less impulsive and more methodical. We're shown one tape of him hitchhiking, convincing an unfortunate couple known to us as the Andersons that his car has broken down. They are kind enough people to offer a ride to the local gas station, but it's a journey that they're never going to fulfill because what then transpires is the brutal attack that involves hitting the male with something that causes him to lose control of the car. The killer then subdues the female using a cloth doused in chloroform, which dooms them to be the next victims in this ever-expanding case. The investigation into the case of the Andersons is what gives us a real insight into the mutilation and just the capabilities that this person has. It's revealed that sometime before any of this happened, the killer had made himself known in the CCTV footage of a gas station. In this footage, he's shown using sign language that, when deciphered, gives clues to the location he planned on disposing of the bodies. We're given no time to process this, however, as we're immediately shown our next incident, which is something I'm going to refer to as the Cheryl Dempsey case, since this is arguably the most notable case and continues to be a plot point throughout. Cheryl Dempsey is a teenage girl that the killer is shown to be stalking. One night when she's home alone with her boyfriend Tim, the killer sneaks into the house and after creeping around, he hides in her closet until the time is right to attack. When this time arrives, he gets what he wants. By the end of the night, Cheryl Dempsey has been abducted and her boyfriend Tim mutilated. His body is left at the scene to be discovered, and it becomes clear sometime after the discovery of the tapes that the crime scene was purposely arranged in order to obscure any possible psychological profiling. This part of the story again does have a very disturbing twist because Cheryl isn't going to be another of his murder victims, as what awaits her is something much, much worse. She is imprisoned in his basement as he spends an undisclosed amount of time abusing her in many different forms, physically, mentally, sexually. The Cheryl Dempsey portion of this movie is arguably the most difficult stuff to sit through, and it somehow only gets more tragic. One of the many things we're forced to witness is the process of him beating her to the point where she breaks, accepting that her name is no longer Cheryl, and that it's now, in fact, Slave. Cheryl's mother, Victoria, appeals to the kidnapper in a statement that's aired on national television and finds herself confronted by the man behind the cruelty, who even documents this event. There is a moment in this scene where the realisation hits Victoria's face, and it's genuinely chilling. The acting here feels real on a scale that most films just fail to match. You know, the look of both desperation and fear on her face as she hears her daughter's kidnapper offer help before chuckling at her pain is gut-wrenching.
I play that moment in my head over and over again. I knew it was him, and I didn't stop him because I was scared.
Today, a third body was found on the west bank of the Hudson. Could it be another killing by the man that some are starting to call the Water Street Butcher?
It's also around this time that we're told the killer has changed his MO, now targeting sex workers while posing as a police officer. With the increasing body count piling up, he begins to be known as the Water Street Butcher, which is something that I'm going to refer to the killer as from this point on. Upon investigating the apartment of a victim sometime later, police identify fingerprints on an unwashed glass that leads to the arrest of a former police officer, James Foley. Due to his history of visiting sex workers, as well as having no alibi for the dates of the abductions and various pieces of evidence found within his car, Foley is ultimately convicted as the Water Street Butcher. Eyewitness statements and sperm samples that are discovered on several victims can also be tied back to him, only further solidifying this conclusion. Foley, for obvious reasons, continues to plead his innocence, but that would just be in vain as he's soon sentenced to death. However, not 1 week later, a leading investigator would find a new map in his mailbox with a message claiming they missed one, alongside the location of a brand new body. From this, it becomes clear that the real killer was not in fact dead, and James Foley had been meticulously framed, adding him to the victim list by proxy. With new information coming to light, Foley is posthumously exonerated of his crimes. However, it's important to note that due to real life events happening at this point in the movie that they chose to incorporate, the knowledge of this part of the case goes widely unrecognised by the audience, or by the general public, meaning that for the most part, a lot of people still probably just believed that the killer was James Foley. This wouldn't have been widespread news. The Water Street Butcher's reign of terror continues, coming to a head when investigators trace the location of his house, utilising the map of an area where one of the abductions took place, and commence a raid on the home. What they find isn't the man they're looking for, however. In fact, this place is so clean that there's not a single fingerprint to be found. This is the raid that leads to the discovery of the tapes, but this wasn't actually all that was discovered here. As well as those, numerous dead bodies, including that of the original tenant, are discovered buried behind the house. The most shocking and perhaps twisted discovery of all, though, is that of Cheryl Dempsey, still alive a full 8 years after her initial abduction. Cheryl Dempsey has been abused and kept in a condition so foul that she has regressed to a shell of her former self, secretly self-harming and torturing herself because in the last 8 years that's the only real form of normalcy that she's known. During an interview with Cheryl that happens when she's brought home, we can see the decomposition of her sanity and the lack of life that remains inside of her. She reveals here that she truly believes her captor loved her and will come back for her. This is absolutely, for me, the most heartbreaking thing in the Poughkeepsie Tapes, and it's the one thing that really pulls on the heartstrings. The complete degradation of Cheryl here compared to her usual self acts as a reminder of just how cruel some people can actually be. Cheryl is a tragic victim of Stockholm Syndrome, and this strikes an unsettling connection with our world where this is something that happens all too frequently. These stories do happen, and as much as we try to prevent them, continue to happen. Soon after this interview, we're then told of the sad news that Cheryl took her own life, leaving behind an 8-year period of pain and suffering that started with one terrifying home invasion and ended with a note declaring her undying love for her master. Now, there's a funeral that's held off screen for Cheryl, and this really should be where we end Cheryl's story and let her story conclude. But there is one final gut punch that the film chooses to leave us on. Not too long after she's buried, her remains are dug up in the middle of the night, disappearing without a trace. As it happens, this also ends up being the last known activity of the Water Street Butcher. As we move into somewhat of an epilogue, we see that the tapes have become a fundamental part of the training required for those looking to become criminal psychologists. We are left with one final note that when watching this for the first time, I was taken aback by, and don't worry, this isn't another tape, this isn't some horrific act of violence, but it's something that creates a whole other layer of fear.
I'll tell you one place we'll be watching. If this documentary thing you're making ever gets to the theaters, he won't be able to help himself. He'll see this movie as many times as he can. We'll keep an eye on as many screenings as we can because he'll be there.
The idea alone, the whole Killer Among Us angle is terror realised on a completely different front to anything else this movie has done. Because it's this that truly personifies the Poughkeepsie Tapes. Despite its direct dedication to remain grounded in reality, it's this cold line delivered with precision that creates that direct link between us and the movie. And for me, that's why this movie remains such a harrowing watch, even today with the knowledge that this didn't actually get a theatrical release. For a little context, the release window that this film had is a little complicated. Now, initially this thing premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2007, a date that would coincide fatefully with Paranormal Activity, and following this premiere, a wide theatrical release was slated for February of 2008, but then for reasons I couldn't precisely source, that was removed. With a lack of a cinema release, that then means that the closing lines ultimately have very little meaning. However, I question if this is then what fed into what I would call an urban legend-like status that this film began to develop. It would eventually receive a brief on-demand release in 2014, with a Blu-ray release finally happening in October 2017. But that didn't mean the movie was completely off limits. Several bootlegged copies were in constant circulation, with the movie probably being available online too. With the limited methods of viewing this considered, it was believed within certain corners of the horror fanbase that what we were seeing was a real snuff film, a genuine movie with real footage that had somehow been released into the wild for public consumption. In case you need me to state it clearly head on, no, the Poughkeepsie Tapes is fiction, not real, merely based loosely on incidents from true serial killings across history. This does give me a lot of appreciation for the film, the fact that John Eric Dowdall was able to competently craft something so foul and cruel, yet keep a level of authenticity to the product, so much so that its validity was speculated on for years, including a viral stint in November of 2020. In all honesty, I can see why too, and a lot of the tapes here, I do feel like it just feels like a concealed camera wanting to document and nothing more. The only time the camera is ever in a revealing position, it's commented on. The killer makes it work, he gives reason for it. You know, this is never about framing a movie, it's about framing a murder, and looking at it like that, I think it becomes a whole lot harder to sit through, especially on top of the possible chances that this was real. I don't think I've ever had a film with such a prolonged effect on me as a viewer, one that elicited such a strong reaction of disgust and unease. To draw yet another comparison to Lake Mungo, it evokes different emotions through the same filmmaking approach. It utilises a very down-to-earth world much like our own, capitalising on the demons behind stories that are sadly commonplace even today. It does this, and as a result creates a story so vivid and lifelike that I can't even blame people for being fooled into thinking that this is a true crime documentary. It just has that vibe to it. I really need this genre to make a strong resurgence because there is infinite potential in the films that could be crafted through this medium. I have seen various reviews of this movie that offer a scattered perspective on what the reception to it was upon its scattered release. I've seen it be called creepy yet a frustrating experience by a critic who slated it for not giving enough of an insight into why the killer brutalised and killed his victims in that manner. Others claimed that it was teasing interesting directions but lost attention the more it lingered on, attempting to find cheap ways to disturb its audience instead of doing anything meaningful. These are points and criticisms personally that I thoroughly disagree with. While seeing the grounds that they're being made on, for me to acknowledge these as criticisms that are valid, it sort of undermines the sort of effect that the Poughkeepsie Tapes is trying to have on the viewer. There is something truly disturbed in seeing something unjust, something we cannot rationalise or reason with, no matter how hard we try. To give reasons to his actions would give personification to a demon or humanity to a depraved monster. I know that none of us are black and white in terms of morality, but I think it speaks to the bold choice of the creatives behind this movie, making a conscious effort to avoid shedding any light of humanity onto this killer. For me, that direct decision encapsulates the horror of what he does a lot more than they could have managed if they'd given him any more depth. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is the purest definition of an acquired taste in horror. It's certainly not going to be for everyone. I'd actually go further and say that most would likely be turned away by its senseless lust for gratuitous violence and unwillingness to surrender anything to the imagination of the viewer. Sadly, despite the strong standing this thing has with fans, the movie holds more of a cult classic status than a well-known entry into the genre. This is something that, as much as I'd want to, I can't say is unjustified because the eventual Blu-ray release of this movie came out at the end of the found footage genre's run as a seriously taken place in horror. However, it's a subgenre that I'm really hoping can make some sort of resurgence in a new creative way, because if it's not obvious to any of you watching, I have a bit of a soft spot for this corner of horror. The true terror of the Poughkeepsie Tapes is the reality behind the trauma it inflicts. True crime is something ingrained into our society, with documentaries on this sort of thing doing worryingly well. I'm unsure why there's such a fascination with the inner demons of these people, but it's true. We as a society do have an unhealthy obsession with serial killers at times, and it's something that's preyed on here. The urban legend-like nature of its release, partnered with the speculation over its validity, were only two of the factors involved in helping craft this low-budget horror film into an incredibly dark work of art, with controversy rooted in its soul. Despite its deeply disturbed core, I adore the Poughkeepsie Tapes, and it is absolutely a movie that will continue to sit with me as one of the scariest things I have ever seen. So that is the Poughkeepsie Tapes, a demented horror film that until this year I didn't even know about, and now, as much as I wish I could scrub it from my mind, I don't think I can. I want to clarify that yes, horror is subjective. There are going to be people that end up going back and watching this movie and commenting down below, I didn't even find this scary, you're just a pussy. And you know what? That's okay, that's fine. This thing is horror as a whole is subjective to a massive degree. The level of scariness in a movie is something that can and will vary depending on the person you ask. That's just the way horror is. Regardless, once again, feel free to let me know in the comments below your thoughts on both this video and also the Poughkeepsie Tapes as a film. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you want to stick around and watch me do more of this sort of thing. I do want to cover more of these films that actually unsettled me a lot in the future, so let me know what other things unsettled you and maybe I'll talk about them. With that being said, I hope you're all having a fantastic day. My name is Jordan, and until next time, this has been Media 13. Goodbye.